Hello, English 150 students. So this is week 7. So here's what's going on this week. First thing we've got going on, you turned in your baby science chart. So this week we've got peer review, and then I'm giving you feedback on it. So I want to tell you about that. So the peer review, all I want you to do for this is just go on and in the comment section, just interpret what the chart means. So say, okay, you're showing us that this is your category, these are your items, and these are your criteria, and just kind of point out what you notice about the chart. So kind of interpret it for them. That's the only thing I want you to do. I mean, you can comment on, they can use other colors or whatever or something like that. But the main thing I want you to do is just interpret that chart for them, show them what you're getting out of it. Okay, so that's the peer review. The second thing is I'm going to comment, I've already commented on your charts. So I gave you a number. I gave you a number. So if I give you a 4, that means you're doing amazingly awesome, good job. If I give you a 3, that means you're good. I may have given you some piece of advice about it, but 3 just means you're fine. 2 means there's you're okay, but there's something wrong with your chart that you need to fix. Something that's like, I can tell you're on the right track, but just something is wrong with your chart. And then if I give you a number 1, that means you're completely off track. You've misunderstood the point of the assignment. You give me the wrong kind of chart or something where you fundamentally have to change everything that you've done, basically. So 3 and 4 mean you're good to go. You don't have to do anything. 2 means there's some change you need to make to your chart before you turn it in on your first attempt. And 1 means you have to fully change everything about your chart and do something totally different. Right? Okay, so there's that. This week, you've got the baby science first attempt paper due. And at the end of this video, I'm going to run you through, I'm going to kind of have a thing where I show you what to do to write each section of the paper. That'll be coming up at the end. I'm not going to do that right now. The third thing that's due this week is reading log number 4. So what this one is an introduction to primary research. This is going to teach you about how to pay attention to your own surroundings, the kind of language to use. And this is for 2 reasons. Hopefully you're going to use some of this kind of language in your methods section and your results section of your baby science paper, but we're mainly going to use it for the Change Something Up experiment, which is coming up in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, you're going to have to give me a proposal about what you're doing for the Change Something Up experiment, and I'll explain more about that in next week's video as well. But again, be thinking about what you think you want to do for that. Okay, so that's the main things going on this week. Now, stay tuned here where I'm going to run you through it. I'm going to give you time to actually write parts of this paper if you want to follow along with this. Okay, here we go. All right, guys, so this is what I would normally do in class with a real class, so we can do this kind of digitally here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you the 4 sections, my requirements for the 4 sections of the paper. I'm going to give you the example from my paper, and then I'm going to tell you to pause it, set a timer for 7 minutes, and then you start writing that section of the paper. So if you follow along with this, you'll have, a good start on your paper. So here we go. So what I'm going to do, I've pulled up my my paper that I wrote about comparing Jordan sneakers. So what I'm going to do now is go to the baby science assignment sheet. So again, that's in Canvas under modules, under assignment sheets. So if we scroll down, we can just see each of the 4 sections: introduction, method, results, discussion. So, oops. Okay, so hopefully you can read that. I don't know if this is going to help. Alrighty, well, here we go. Alright, so introduction. So there's 3 main jobs that I need you to do for the introduction. 1, introduce the categories, the items, and the criteria. You have to mention all 3 of them extremely clearly. Looking at this category of water bottles, Jordan sneakers, movies made by these people in this year, sweatshirts, whatever, right? Your category. Then you have to mention the items. What this is like why you chose the items that you did. Say I know somebody's doing Marvel movies and they put all 23 Marvel movies on their chart, and I told them you can't do all 23, you need to do 10 because that's the requirements for the assignment. But then what you need to do is tell us, why did you choose those 10? Okay? You could have chosen anything. Why did you choose those 10 sweatshirts, those 10 water bottles? What is it about those that made you choose those as opposed to everything that's available? And then the criteria. You have to describe why people think about those criteria when they think about that category of item, right? Then tell us why you're discussing this topic or why it might be interesting to you or anyone. And then if there's any relevant historical background or context that you can give to help them understand, that would be the best, right? Okay, so here's what I did. I'll read my introduction here. So Michael Jordan's signature basketball shoes have played a large role in shaping American culture. Many people, from hip-hop artists to preachers, wear Jordans as a symbol of status or cultural awareness. So I'm just giving a big picture. One, this does two things, right? It gives a reason why I'm talking about this. Michael Jordan sneakers are a big deal. They've played a big role. And also I'm just introducing the category of things, right? Michael Jordan sneakers. Okay. The original Michael Jordan basketball sneaker was made in 1984. It was designed by Tinker Hatfield, among others. 86, a new version of the Air Jordan, the Jordan 2, was released. Hatfield was not on the design team. I explained this because it matters later. The reason that I'm bringing up Tinker Hatfield is because he ends up playing a big role when I start deciding what shoes I like better. And so introducing the idea of Tinker Hatfield is really important here. I'm not just bringing it up because it's interesting or whatever. It matters later on. Then 88, Hatfield rejoined the team to design the Air Jordan 3. After that, they released a new version of the Air Jordan sneaker each year, each new design trying to top the last. The designs increased in complexity over the years. So this is where I introduce one of my criteria, right? The complexity of design. That's one of the, so if we go down to my chart, this is one axis. So all of this history was meant to lead into the idea that every year the shoes got more and more complex as they were trying to top the last design, right? I also talk about the ways, later on in my methods, I talk about how I'm talking about complexity. So they added straps, color combinations, and new materials. Those are the three things that I talk about in my methods section that I use to judge the complexity of the shoes. So I bring them up in the introduction as a way to prep for that, right? So the first 10 versions of the sneakers are iconic and continue to be produced in a different color combinations to this day. So that's kind of my justification for why I chose these 10. Just the first 10 is what I did. Jordan sneakers 1 through 10. Then I give some other background. I personally became a fan of Air Jordans recently and want to start building a collection. Here is why it's interesting to me and why I'm looking at it. Each pair costing from $120 to $1,000. I need to prioritize the order in which to purchase them. Okay, so that's my justification of why I'm talking about this. So then by charting, I talk about being a fan of simpler designs and how complexity figures into my judgment of them. Then by charting the first 10 Jordan shoes, using these two criteria, the complexity of design and the likelihood I will purchase a pair, I can determine my priorities for purchasing each pair of Jordans I add to my collection. So those are the three jobs that I've asked you to do in the introduction. Tell us the category, the items, and the criteria. Tell us why this is important. And then if you need to give any relevant historical background or context. So those are the three things that I did. Okay, so now pause this video, open up a word processor, set a timer for 7 minutes, and try to do those three things right there. And go. Okay, hopefully you're back. And now we'll move on to the methods section. Okay, so you should have, just like I have, a heading that says methods. And now we begin the methods section. So the jobs that you have here are to tell how you determine the 10 items that fit into the category if there isn't an obvious reason. You don't have to talk about it if it's just there's only 10 of a thing or whatever, right? Then, if your criteria are subjective, tell us how you determined your evaluation, right? So if it has anything to do with quality or feel or taste or something that can't be measured with just a single number, you got to tell us how did you come up with your way of determining that. If the criteria are objective, then the job that you have is to explain where you got the information from or how you determined it. So if you're talking about price or an Amazon rating or something, why do you feel like the Amazon rating is a good way to use? Or where did you get the price from? And how do you know you can trust that price? If you cite a source, explain why the source is credible. So what I did is I tell what I did. I found comparable models of shoes. I found the black and red color scheme of each of the first 10 models. Then I used Photoshop to isolate just the right side view of the shoe. So to determine complexity design, this is where I'm talking about my subjective criteria, complexity of design. I took 4 factors into account: the number of different colors, closure systems, which are laces, straps, toggles, and buckles, jaggedness of lines in the design, and the number of different materials in the design. So I clearly state, here's how I'm taking this subjective idea of complexity, and I'm giving like specific things I can look at from the pictures that I have. Then to determine the likelihood I would buy a pair, I relied almost entirely on my subjective opinion of how much I like them, also my familiarity of how well the shoes sell based on my experience watching the website StockX, and if there are any celebrities, especially hip-hop artists that I like, that have worn the shoes at major public events, right? So just, I'm explaining, taking this vague idea of the likelihood that I would buy a pair, and I'm trying to put as clear an idea of how I'm coming up with that as possible. I created a scatter plot chart, moved the shoes around until their placement made sense to me. Okay, so again, you have to explain to us your subjective criteria or tell us if you have objective criteria, which I didn't have. But if you do have objective criteria, where did you get that information from and why is that source credible? And how you determine the 10 items. I didn't really do that because it was obvious. I said just the first 10 sneakers. Okay, so pause it and take a 7-minute timer and write that. So here we go. Pause now. Okay, and you're back. All right, so the results section. What we're doing here is obviously putting the chart. That's the first thing, right? The most important thing. You show us your chart. So display your graph and then use words to describe the resulting graph you have in explicit detail, right? We want to be able to know what you're seeing. So describe and justify your choices for positioning items on the chart as you have. So that's if you have subjective criteria, right? Then you move those things around. You're talking about where the things are on the chart based on your subjective criteria. And then, so here's the main thing to pay attention to here. Describe the chart, but pay attention to the most or highest, the least or lowest, any outliers, or any trends in the data. So if we look at my chart here, there's kind of an overall trend of the more complex they are, the less likely they are that I'm going to buy them, right? But so the highest is the Jordan 1. I'm the most likely to buy this, and it's the least complex, so that makes perfect sense. The most complex is the Jordan 8, and that's the least likely to buy, right? So there's this trend, but then there's a couple of outliers, especially the Jordan 2, which has a very simple design, but I'm not very likely to buy it. So I have to talk about that. Why? Why is it that this one, in your results section, like, what is it about this one being outside, being an outlier, or the Jordan 5, right? Which is pretty complex, but I still like it, right? So I got to talk about that. So here's what I said in the results section. The designs for the most part seem to increase in complexity with each successive model, with the exception of the Jordan 6, right? So they kind of have this increasing complexity, but the Jordan 6 was a little bit simpler than the 7, 8, or than the 4 and the 5 in terms of materials and stuff like that. Fewer materials, just as I expected, my preference for shoes diminished with the increasing complexity, right? The most notable exception was the Jordan 2, which has a fairly simple design. It doesn't include the Nike swoosh, and I'm very unlikely to purchase it. Tinker Hatfield wasn't involved in the design process for the Jordan 2. So the highest, the shoe I want the most is a Jordan 1, and I actually already own a pair, right? It has clean lines, and I talk about the lines, talk about the colors, talk about the closure system, and the materials, right? Did I mention it's only leather? I should have mentioned that. It's only, mainly leather. The best place to start my collection, and I talk about celebrities, right? That was one of the parts of the thing. And the shoe I'm least likely to talk about or to buy is the Jordan 8. So I did the highest and then the lowest. I talk about why it's the lowest. Double straps, double buckles, crisscrossing lines over the laces, multiple materials, multiple colors, right? It's a very complex design, and not a lot of people wear them. Not very many famous people wear the 8s and stuff like that. And then the ones that surprise me, Jordan 5 surprising with. They're quite complex, has a sliding buckle on the laces, jagged lines on the side, but I really like it and want to buy a pair of 5s, right? And so that one was surprising to me. So I chose to highlight that in the results section. So, okay, again, set a timer for 7 minutes, pause me, and write a description of your chart that pays attention to the highest, the lowest, the overall trends, and the outliers, and that explains, kind of what's going on in the chart. Okay, finally we're in the discussion section. So the point of the discussion section is to make sense of the information in a way that goes just beyond reporting what you found, right? So you're not talking about the graph anymore. Now you're talking about what the graph means, discussing the implications of the results. You can also talk about the limitations. So if you only had access to certain things, or through the chart you start to realize, well, I didn't really discuss this very correctly, or the chart doesn't really show this aspect of the comparison or something like that. That's where you would talk about it in the discussion section. Another thing I'd like you to do is make a suggestion or recommendation for the readers based on some action to take, and bring up further questions you have now that you've seen this, right? So in my chart, the discussion, I said, I began this thinking that I would clearly see a trend of my being less likely to want to buy the more complex versions of the Jordans. For the most part, this is true. However, I did find that the 4 and 5s were quite complex and still high on my list, right? So any surprises you have, I was surprised that Tinker Hatfield played a bigger role than I thought he did in how much I liked shoes. That wasn't something that I had taken into account, but then once I made that chart, I started to discover that. So talk about discoveries and surprises in your discussion section. I talk about how I already bought a pair of ones, and that makes sense because where they are in the chart, right? And how I feel good about that purchase. I talk about the limitation as a comparison of the color scheme seems to affect whether or not I like the shoe and the complexity of the design. So I tried to only compare the black and red, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I like it. So there's a pair of 3s that I really like, but they're not the black and red design. There's a pair of 4s that I really like, but they're not the black and red design. So that complicates this so that limitation made the chart not really work. The other thing is, I found the pair of Jordan 10s that I found don't actually exist in the real world. These are this custom-made pair that there aren't any black and reds like the way this one looks, and so it doesn't really make sense to compare this Jordan 10 to the other ones because I can't even go to a store and buy it because it's just a specifically designed thing. But then I go on to talk about how the reader can, because this was personally for me, it doesn't make sense for them to, use this to buy their own shoes because they have their own criteria. But the 4 criteria that I used to talk about complexity of design is something somebody could use, right? If you're going to look at shoes and you want to know why do these look more complex, I've talked about jaggedness of lines, number of different colors, number of types of closure systems, number of different materials, that's an important thing that somebody could carry on and then use to judge something else, not even maybe shoes, right? You could talk about, countries' flags or something by using the same materials or something. I don't know. Right? Okay, so that's the results section, or the discussion section, where you make sense of things, discuss implications of the results. So I'm going to end this video now, and so what I want you to do is go and write the discussion section. So hopefully you've been following along. If not, hopefully you can watch this over and over. I'll put the little timer thing across the bottom so you can find where you are. And follow along with this and use this to guide you as you write your first attempt of this essay. Good luck with that, and we'll see you guys.